Okay, here we go. One little sip. It's not even whiskey. It's just whiskey-flavored water. You know what that is. That's where you pour a little bit of whiskey in a glass and you fill the rest up with water. Whiskey-flavored water. So when studying metaphysics and when studying revolutions, always try not to be satisfied with the simple explanation about why something happened or the main or the only reason why something happened. That's really the opposite of an analysis. So let's speak for a few minutes about analytic philosophy. Analytic philosophy is a branch and tradition of philosophy using analysis, which is popular in the Western world and particularly the Anglosphere. Anglosphere. Man, learning all sorts of new words this time. Which is popular, which began around the turn of the 20th century in the contemporary era and continues today. In the United Kingdom, United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Scandinavia, the majority of university philosophy departments today identify themselves as analytic departments. Analytic philosophy is characterized by an emphasis on language known as the linguistic turn, and for its clarity and rigor in arguments, making use of formal logic and mathematics, and, to a lesser degree, the natural sciences. It also takes things piecemeal in an attempt to focus philosophical reflection on smaller problems that lead to answers to bigger questions. Analytic philosophy is often understood in contrast to other philosophical traditions, most notably continental philosophies such as existentialism, phenomenology, and Hegelianism. So, the history of analytic philosophy, taking a narrower sense of the 20th, 21st century view, is usually thought to begin with the rejection of British idealism, a neo-Hegelian movement. So, now, who wants to guess what Wikipedia has to say about whiskey? Whiskey, or whiskey, with or without an E, is a type of distilled alcoholic beverage made from fermented grain mash. Various grains, which may be malted, are used for different varieties, including barley, corn, rye, and wheat. Whiskey is typically aged in wooden casks, which are often old sherry casks, or may also be made of charred white oak. Whiskey is strictly regulated spirit worldwide, with many classes and types. The typical unifying characteristics of the different classes and types are the fermentation of grains, distillation, and aging in wooden barrels. I just had a thought. Hopefully you'll find it interesting also. In my studies of philosophy and religion, I don't know how I came across this fact just randomly, or if I sought it out, because it was so long ago. But I learned, and this is coming off of the fact that whiskey is highly regulated, okay? Now, something I learned way back in my years at Gettysburg College, or a fact I came across, was that, as many or most people know, mescaline is a natural hallucinogen. You hallucinate when you take mescaline. It ordinarily came from, I don't know what type of cactus. There's a button, and if you've ever seen the Oliver Stone Doors movie, there's a pretty interesting mescaline sequence. But it's a psychedelic. It's definitely a powerful thing. So first of all, consider the fact that most cultures around the world had some mystical part of their culture, or had some shaman or medicine man who really provided some guidance. They were the ones that went on these weird explorations of the mind with the mescaline. But somehow that's become very, very taboo, hasn't it? in Western culture, I hate to think that there is no place for the mystical in Western culture. And to say something is mystical, to me, is just to say that we don't have all the answers, and that's fine. But the reason I brought it up was there is a law. I don't know if it's a federal or it's one of our state laws here in the United States that says, and don't quote me, and I'm not a lawyer, okay, but it was something like if you are a descendant of certain Native American tribes and you are at least 1/16 Native American, you are permitted to use mescaline in the United States of America. So that's precisely the sort of ruling, law, that seems to me to illustrate just how arbitrary many, many things are. So let's get back to George Washington and the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, back in the late 18th century, the United States, of course, had just formed out of the 13 colonies. George Washington's your president. They got to come up with some money from somewhere, so they decide they're going to tax whiskey. So this didn't come from out of nowhere. This was not a blind shot across the bow. People had to, at some level, understand that the United States had to pay for this war one way or another. We had debt. We just overthrown the British Empire. At no small expense of blood or treasure. The people were upset because we had revolted just less than a generation earlier about a tax on tea. So these are all forces that had been building for some time, but when it came to the Whiskey Rebellion, it reached the tipping point, the inflection point, the straw on the camel's back. So when you realize that people thought they had finally won their independence and the first new act, well, not the first one, but the government decides to tax whiskey and tries to collect it, everybody shows everybody else they're very serious, and ultimately the kind and brave brilliance of George Washington kept it all together, kept it from going up in flames. And that's a pretty good end for Section 2 of the podcast, and we will catch up with you on the other side. And we're back on Andy's Philosophy Corner. Hello, cats and kittens. Part 3 of 3 regarding revolution and the Whiskey Rebellion. A tiny bit about myself. Yes, my degree is in liberal arts. How that benefits you is the fact that with a liberal arts degree, you have more intense studies of a greater number of subjects, which might seem like a drag at the time. The idea is that with a liberal arts degree, you can speak a little bit of engineer, and you can speak a little bit of French, and you can understand a little bit about economics, and you have maybe a little bit better grasp on history simply because, I mean, that's the idea. You've spent more time on it. So anyway, so the idea is to try to tie together different schools or different disciplines. And in my case, it's philosophy with other areas of studies. So, okay, housekeeping. In a previous segment, I mentioned the straw that broke the camel's back. Right up front, no camels were harmed in the making of this podcast. I make no guarantees about the other episodes, but this one, no camels were harmed in the making of this podcast. So one hump or two, my apologies. Random note, I wondered if there were ever any 3-humped camels. So Google just told me that just this year, a colony of 3-humped camels has been discovered in Oman. Reminds me of a joke about a three-legged turkey. I had an idea for the podcast. I thought, what if I told a really long, weird joke, but saved the punchline for the following podcast? Would that be a jerk move? Is that clever? Is it funny? Is it endearing? Does it make my butt look big? You tell me. All right. So back to rebellion and hopefully metaphysics. Rebellion may be defined as an individual or a group of individuals joined to overthrow or to transform a system or another group. Since systems are in constant change, you need a little bit more, a couple other specifics. We should probably stipulate that rebellion always involves substantial, out of the ordinary change, not just ordinary change, which, hey, it's not an easy subject there. I mean, that's not the idea. So rebellion is always, in one way or another, conflict. So let's look at what type of conflict they will teach you about in psychology classes. They usually tell you there are a finite number of types of conflict. Man versus self. Man versus man. Man versus group or society. And those are really the basic types. So this is a philosophy podcast. Let me quickly go to Karl Marx. And now postmodernists believe, Marx and his postmodernist ideological lineage believe that none of these struggles, man versus self versus man versus group, none of these matter nearly as much as group versus group. And that is the true reality. That's the world we live in. Your group defines almost everything about you. It defines almost what you are told to believe and understand to your core about people in other groups. And most importantly, it defines who is friend and who is foe, since it's a struggle. You have friends and you have foes, right? So you need that IFF, that identify friend or foe, terminology used in the military. Slight deviation, but I just studied up on the Battle of Britain in World War II. It's amazing. There are many good movies and documentaries. And I bring up identify friend or foe because Britain had this brand new invention called radar. And not only did they like the fact that it was spelled the same frontwards as backwards, but it also gave them the ability to spot incoming German aircraft. So the much smaller but super organized and smart British Royal Air Force, the Royal Air Force, the RAF, was able to successfully defend Britain and give the first huge military defeat to, well, you know, that guy. It's cliche to mention the name. So, anyway, the Brits' ability to identify friends and foes so early saved countless lives, and it was an amazing achievement. Now, I don't even think we can really categorize Marx, getting back to that guy, as a philosopher. You know, his book, Das Kapital, it's basically getting people fired up and upset, telling them that they were oppressed. Any of this starting to sound familiar? Here's your enemy, go after him. You know, Das Kapital is more like The Prince by Machiavelli. So The Prince by Machiavelli was a guide, or was advice and counsel that Machiavelli would give to popes and emperors and kings. He's like, oh, okay, well, you are in power and you want to keep power, or you're losing power and you need to regain power, or you want to conquer somewhere else. The Prince by Machiavelli just tells you, here are the different tactics and methods that have been used over the eons by humankind. You know, for example, if you want to take over a country, okay, If you want to take over a country, here's one way